He shoved the teen aside to steal his seat, thinking no one was watching. But seconds later, he froze as the boy's father stepped out of the cockpit. The airplane's aisle stretched before Marcus Williams like a narrow battlefield, passengers shuffling toward their seats with tired resignation. The 17-year-old clutched his boarding pass, 14A, window seat, and tried to ignore the knot forming in his stomach. Flying alone always made him nervous, but this trip to visit his grandmother in Atlanta was important. She'd been asking for him since her surgery, and his mother had finally saved enough for the ticket. As Marcus approached row 14, he noticed a middle-aged white man already occupying his seat. The stranger wore an expensive suit and gold watch, his briefcase positioned possessively on the armrest. Marcus checked his boarding pass again, then cleared his throat politely. "Excuse me, sir. I think you're in my seat." The man didn't look up from his phone, fingers dancing across the screen with practiced indifference. "I don't think so, kid," the man replied without lifting his eyes. "I always sit by the window." "Find another seat." His voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to getting his way, each word delivered like a business transaction he'd already won. Marcus felt heat rise in his cheeks, but his mother's voice echoed in his mind. "Be respectful, baby. Choose your battles wisely." "Sir, my boarding pass clearly shows 14A, Marcus said, holding up the paper with trembling fingers. "Maybe you could check yours." Other passengers began to notice the interaction, some stopping to watch while others hurried past, eager to avoid confrontation. The man finally looked up, his pale blue eyes scanning Marcus from head to toe with unconcealed disdain. "Listen, boy," the man said, standing slowly to his full height of 6 feet. "I paid good money for this flight, and I'm not moving for some—" He caught himself before finishing the sentence, but the unspoken word hung in the recycled air like poison. Marcus's hands clenched into fists at his sides, 17 years of similar encounters flooding back in a wave of familiar humiliation. The man's name tag read, Richard Sterling, Executive, and he wore it like armor against accountability. Without warning, Richard's elbow shot out, connecting with Marcus's ribs as he pushed past. "Move along, kid. Find another seat before security removes you." The impact sent Marcus stumbling backward into the aisle, his backpack spilling open and scattering belongings across the floor. Passengers gasped, some reaching for their phones to record what looked like an escalating confrontation. An elderly woman shook her head in disgust while a businessman pretended to study his magazine. Marcus dropped to his knees, frantically gathering his scattered items, textbooks, his grandmother's letters, the small photo of his father in uniform that he carried everywhere. "That's assault," Marcus said quietly, standing with his possessions clutched against his chest. His voice shook with controlled anger, but he kept his tone level and clear. "You can't just push me and take my seat." Richard settled back into 14A with a satisfied smirk, buckling his seatbelt like a king claiming his throne. "Prove it," Richard challenged, gesturing toward the watching passengers. "I'm sure these fine people saw you stumble." Clumsy teenagers these days. Several passengers looked away uncomfortably, unwilling to get involved in what they perceived as someone else's problem. The flight attendant call button remained unpressed. Responsibility diffused among dozens of silent witnesses. Marcus stood in the aisle, dignity warring with practical concerns about making his connection in Atlanta. His grandmother was counting on him, and causing a scene might mean missing the flight entirely. But something deeper burned in his chest, the accumulated weight of every time he'd been told to step aside, move along, know his place. This time felt different, charged with electricity that made his skin tingle. The airplane engines hummed to life outside, and Marcus realized they were preparing for departure. Soon the cabin doors would close, trapping him in this moment of decision. He could find another seat and swallow his pride, or he could stand his ground and face whatever consequences followed. His father's photo seemed to burn against his chest through his shirt, a reminder of the man who'd taught him that dignity was worth fighting for. "Last chance, kid," Richard said, adjusting his position in the stolen seat. "Find somewhere else to sit, or I'll call security myself." His threat carried the confidence of someone who'd never faced real consequences for his actions, never had to question whether the system would side with him. Marcus took a deep breath, tasting the recycled airplane air that suddenly felt thick with possibility. The cabin door at the front of the plane remained open, but Marcus could see ground crew preparing to close it. Time was running out for a peaceful resolution, and Richard Sterling clearly had no intention of admitting his mistake or showing basic human decency. The moment stretched between them like a taut wire, ready to snap at the slightest pressure. Marcus opened his mouth to respond, but before he could speak, the sound of heavy footsteps echoed from the cockpit area. The airplane captain was making his routine pre-flight walk through the cabin, and his steady approach would bring him directly past their confrontation. Marcus felt his heart rate spike, uncertain whether this development would help or hurt his cause. Captain James Williams emerged from the cockpit with the measured stride of a man who'd navigated 30 years of turbulence, both literal and metaphorical. His navy blue uniform bore 4 gold stripes on each shoulder, marking him as senior captain of the airline's most prestigious routes. At 45, James carried himself with the quiet authority of someone who'd earned respect through competence rather than volume. He nodded professionally to passengers as he passed, conducting his standard pre-flight inspection of the cabin. The routine served multiple purposes, ensuring safety compliance, gauging passenger mood, and showing his crew that leadership meant visibility. Today's flight to Atlanta carried particular significance. It was his first time piloting the route where his son would be traveling as a passenger. James had been looking forward to seeing Marcus at 30,000 feet, perhaps stopping by his seat to share a private moment before landing. The boy was growing into a fine young man, despite the challenges of having an airline pilot father who was gone more often than home. This trip to visit his grandmother represented Marcus's growing independence, something James both celebrated and worried about. As he moved through first class, James noticed the usual collection of business travelers and frequent flyers who barely acknowledged his presence. These passengers took smooth flights for granted, never considering the thousands of decisions that kept them safe at altitude. He appreciated their trust, but sometimes wondered if they understood the weight of responsibility that came with 4 gold stripes. Approaching the main cabin, James heard raised voices, not unusual during boarding, but something in the tone made his pilot instincts alert. Passenger disputes could quickly escalate into security situations that delayed flights and rattled other travelers. He quickened his pace, professional obligation overriding his personal schedule of greeting his son. The scene that greeted him in row 14 stopped James cold. A well-dressed man sat smugly in a window seat while a young black teenager stood in the aisle, clearly distressed and clutching scattered belongings. The body language spoke volumes: defensive posture from the boy, aggressive satisfaction from the man, uncomfortable avoidance from surrounding passengers. James had witnessed countless passenger disputes over the years, usually involving luggage space or reclining seats. But something about this situation felt different, charged with an energy that made his stomach tighten. The teenager's face was turned away, but his build and clothing seemed oddly familiar, triggering a recognition that James couldn't quite place. "Is there a problem here?" James asked, his captain's voice carrying natural authority without aggression. He'd learned that most conflicts could be diffused with calm professional intervention before they required security involvement. The suited man looked up with practiced charm, already formulating his version of events. "No problem at all, Captain," Richard Sterling replied smoothly. "Just a confused young passenger who can't find his assigned seat. I'm sure your flight attendants can help him locate available seating." His tone suggested that this was a minor inconvenience beneath the captain's attention, a small matter that could be handled by subordinates. James turned toward the teenager, who was slowly raising his head to meet his eyes. The moment of recognition hit like lightning through clear sky. Those were his own dark eyes looking back at him, set in the face that combined his features with his ex-wife's delicate bone structure. Marcus, his son, standing in the aisle like a defendant waiting for judgment. The pieces crashed together in James's mind. His son's flight number, the route to Atlanta, the timing that should have put Marcus in seat 14A. This wasn't a random passenger dispute. This was his child being humiliated by a man who'd clearly stolen his assigned seat. Every parental instinct screamed for immediate action, but his captain's training demanded controlled response. Marcus's eyes widened as he recognized his father, surprise mixing with embarrassment at being discovered in this situation. He'd wanted to handle the problem independently, to prove his maturity during his first solo flight. Instead, his father had stumbled upon him being bullied by a passenger who clearly thought a black teenager made an easy target. "Captain Williams?" Marcus said quietly, his voice carrying 17 years of love, respect, and now desperate hope for rescue. The formal address felt strange given their relationship, but Marcus understood intuitively that his father was working, that this moment required professional rather than personal handling. Richard Sterling's confident expression flickered as he processed the exchange. The teenager knew the captain by name, spoke to him with familiarity that suggested more than casual recognition. His businessman's instincts began cataloging potential complications, though he couldn't yet grasp the full scope of his mistake. "This is your flight, isn't it, Marcus?" James said carefully, each word chosen with surgical precision. He could see his son's boarding pass clutched in trembling fingers, could read 14A clearly printed on the paper. The math was simple, but the implications were complex. This wasn't just theft of a seat, but assault on his child. The cabin fell silent except for the hum of auxiliary power and the distant sounds of ground crew preparing for departure. Passengers sensed something significant was unfolding, though most couldn't yet identify what had shifted the atmosphere from minor dispute to something much more serious. James felt the weight of multiple responsibilities, father, captain, authority figure, converging in a single moment. Richard Sterling cleared his throat, beginning to understand that his assumptions about easy targets and unchallenged authority might have been premature. "Captain, I'm sure we can resolve this simple misunderstanding without disrupting your flight schedule." His voice carried less certainty now, businessman's instincts warning him that the situation had evolved beyond his control. James looked down at the man who had assaulted his son, who had tried to steal from his child, who had counted on a system that would side with expensive suits over black teenagers. 30 years of professional restraint warred with 17 years of paternal love, while dozens of passengers waited to see which would prevail. The airplane cabin transformed into a pressure cooker as James Williams stared at the man occupying his son's seat. Every training session about customer service and de-escalation seemed to evaporate in the face of parental fury that built like storm clouds behind his professional mask. Richard Sterling shifted uncomfortably under the captain's intense gaze, finally beginning to grasp that this wasn't a routine passenger dispute. "Mr. Sterling," James said, reading the man's name tag with deliberate emphasis, "I need to see your boarding pass." His voice remained level, but Marcus recognized the dangerous quiet that preceded his father's rare but memorable explosions of anger. Growing up, he'd seen that tone used exactly 3 times, once with a teacher who'd made racist assumptions, once with a neighbor who'd called police on Marcus for walking in his own neighborhood, and once with his mother's boyfriend who'd raised his hand during an argument. Richard fumbled for his boarding pass, confidence cracking like ice under pressure. "Of course, Captain. I'm in 14A, as you can see." He produced the pass with shaking fingers, though something in his manner suggested he already knew what it would reveal. The paper trembled slightly as he handed it over, his earlier arrogance replaced by growing apprehension. James examined the boarding pass with the meticulous attention he usually reserved for flight plans. "Mr. Sterling, this shows seat 22C middle seat, toward the back of the aircraft." Each word dropped like stones into still water, creating ripples of realization throughout the watching passengers. Phones began emerging from pockets and purses as people sensed they were witnessing something extraordinary. "There must be some mistake," Richard said weakly, though his protest lacked conviction. "I always fly first class. My assistant must have... the airline must have..." His excuses trailed off as he realized no one was buying his performance. The evidence was clear, witnesses were abundant, and the captain's expression suggested that explanations were no longer welcome. Marcus watched his father process the situation with the systematic approach that had made him one of the airline's most respected pilots. James was cataloging every detail: the theft of the seat, the physical assault, the attempted intimidation of his minor child. But beneath the professional analysis, Marcus could see something else building, the protective rage of a father watching his son being victimized. "Sir?" You need to gather your belongings and move to your assigned seat immediately, James said, his captain's authority now carrying the weight of personal investment. And I need to inform you that pushing my son in the aisle constitutes assault, which I'm required to report to both airline security and local authorities. The words "my son" rang through the cabin like a bell, clarifying the stakes for everyone within earshot. The revelation hit surrounding passengers like an electric shock. Whispered conversations erupted as people realized they'd witnessed a man assault a pilot's child and attempt to steal his seat. The casual racism that had seemed merely distasteful moments before now felt dangerous and criminal. Several passengers began openly recording, understanding that they were documenting something significant. Richard Sterling's face cycled through emotions like a broken traffic light: confusion, fear, anger, and finally a desperate attempt to regain control. Now wait just a minute, Captain. You can't use your position to intimidate passengers. I have rights, and I won't be railroaded by some affirmative action pilot playing favorites with his... He caught himself before finishing the sentence, but the implication hung in the recycled air like toxic smoke. The cabin fell silent except for the sound of James Williams removing his captain's hat and setting it carefully on an empty seat. The gesture was simple but loaded with meaning. He was temporarily setting aside his professional obligations to address a father's business. Marcus had never seen his father remove his hat during duty, and the sight sent chills down his spine. "What did you just say?" James asked, stepping closer to Richard Sterling. His voice dropped to barely above a whisper, but it carried the force of 30 years of dealing with casual racism disguised as reasonable doubt. "Please repeat that last part, Mr. Sterling. I want to make sure I understand your position correctly." The invitation sounded friendly, but everyone recognized it as anything but. Richard Sterling realized he'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. The successful businessman who'd built his career on reading people and situations had catastrophically misread this one. He was trapped in a window seat by a furious father who happened to be the plane's captain, surrounded by recording devices and hostile witnesses with no escape route available. "I didn't mean..." "Look, Captain, let's be reasonable here," Richard stammered. "Maybe we got off on the wrong foot. I'm sure we can work something out like civilized people." His attempt at diplomacy sounded hollow even to his own ears, the desperation of someone watching his assumptions about privilege and protection crumble in real time. James picked up his captain's hat and placed it back on his head with ceremonial precision. When he spoke again, his voice carried the full weight of his authority and responsibility. "Mr. Sterling, you have assaulted a minor passenger, stolen his assigned seat, and used what I can only interpret as racially charged language to justify your actions. As captain of this aircraft, I have the authority and obligation to remove passengers who pose a threat to safety and security." The oxygen seemed to thin in the cabin as passengers realized they were witnessing something unprecedented. Most had never seen a captain confront a passenger so directly, and certainly not with the personal stakes that elevated this beyond routine enforcement. Marcus stood frozen in the aisle, proud of his father's protection but worried about the professional consequences of such a public confrontation. Richard Sterling's businessman instincts finally kicked in, calculating the potential damage to his reputation and career if this incident went viral. "Captain Williams, I think we should discuss this privately, perhaps in your office or through proper channels. This is hardly the place for..." His suggestion was interrupted by the sound of footsteps as flight attendants approached, drawn by the unusual commotion in the main cabin. "There's nothing to discuss privately," James replied, his voice carrying to every corner of the aircraft. "You assaulted my son. You stole his seat. You questioned my qualifications based on my race. These are facts witnessed by dozens of passengers, some of whom are recording this interaction. The only question now is whether you're going to move to your assigned seat voluntarily or whether airport security will remove you from my aircraft." The airplane cabin crackled with tension as 24 cell phones captured every word and gesture. Richard Sterling found himself trapped not just by the window seat, but by the digital witnesses documenting his humiliation. His expensive suit suddenly felt like costume jewelry under the harsh cabin lighting, his authority evaporating like morning fog in the face of real consequences. "You can't do this," Richard said, his voice rising with desperation. "I'm a platinum member of this airline. I spend $50,000 a year on flights. My company has contracts worth millions with your employer." He reached for his phone, fingers shaking as he searched for someone who might leverage his position. "I'm calling my lawyer. This is discrimination, harassment, abuse of power." James Williams watched the performance with the detached interest of someone who'd seen countless emergencies unfold. In 30 years of flying, he'd learned that panic revealed character. Some people rose to meet challenges while others collapsed into self-protecting hysteria. Richard Sterling was clearly in the second category, grasping for any weapon that might restore his crumbling dominance. "By all means, call your lawyer," James replied calmly. "I'm sure they'll be fascinated to hear how you assaulted a minor, stole his seat, and then used racial slurs when confronted by his father. That's quite a trifecta of criminal behavior, Mr. Sterling." His professional composure remained intact, but Marcus could see the storm building behind his father's eyes. Marcus stepped forward, finding his voice despite the surreal nature of watching his father publicly defend him. "Dad, it's okay. I can sit somewhere else. I don't want you to get in trouble because of me." His attempt at peacekeeping came from 17 years of watching his father navigate a world that constantly questioned his competence and authority. "No, son," James said firmly, never taking his eyes off Richard Sterling. "You have an assigned seat that you paid for. This man has no right to take it from you, and certainly no right to put his hands on you when you objected." The father's voice blended seamlessly with the captain's authority, creating something more powerful than either alone. Richard Sterling's phone call apparently wasn't going as planned. His voice became increasingly shrill as he tried to explain the situation to someone who clearly wasn't providing the support he'd expected. "What do you mean you can't help?" "I'm a client. This is exactly the kind of situation I pay for. No, I can't just move to another seat, because it's the principle of the thing." The surrounding passengers began to shift from passive observers to active participants in the drama. An elderly black woman in row 15 stood up, her voice clear and strong despite her age. "Young man," she called to Marcus, "you hold your ground. Your father's right. You don't let anybody push you around and take what's yours." Her support seemed to give other passengers permission to choose sides. "That's right," added a middle-aged Latino man across the aisle. "I saw the whole thing. This guy pushed the kid and took his seat. Captain's just doing his job." More voices joined in, creating a chorus of support that transformed the isolated incident into a community response. Richard Sterling found himself outnumbered not just by authority, but by basic human decency. A flight attendant named Sarah approached cautiously, her training in conflict resolution warring with the obvious complexity of the situation. "Captain Williams, is there anything I can do to help resolve this?" She'd worked with James for 5 years and had never seen him this focused and dangerous. The usually calm pilot radiated controlled fury that made the air around him seem to shimmer. "Yes, Sarah," James replied, without breaking his stare with Richard Sterling. "Please contact airport security and have them meet us at the gate. We have a passenger who needs to be removed for assault and theft of services. Also, I want a full incident report filed with both local police and the airline's security department." His instructions were clear, professional, and absolutely final. Richard Sterling's phone conversation ended abruptly, apparently not with the support he desperately sought. His lawyer, whoever that was, had clearly advised him that his position was legally indefensible and potentially career-ending. The businessman's last refuge, connections and influence, was proving inadequate against documented criminal behavior and viral social media exposure. "Captain, please." Richard tried one more approach, his voice dropping to what he probably thought was a reasonable tone. "I'm sorry about the misunderstanding. I'll move to my assigned seat right now. We don't need to involve security or make this bigger than it needs to be." His offer came too late and with too little sincerity to be taken seriously. James finally moved, stepping aside to clear the aisle while maintaining visual contact with the man who'd assaulted his son. "Mr. Sterling, you had multiple opportunities to do the right thing. You chose to escalate at every turn. You don't get to de-escalate now that you realize there are consequences for your actions." His judgment was delivered with the finality of a court verdict. The cabin buzzed with conversations as passengers shared their perspectives on what they'd witnessed. Most seemed firmly on the side of the young man and his pilot father, but a few uncomfortable shifts and whispered comments suggested that not everyone was ready to condemn Richard Sterling's behavior. The divide reflected larger societal tensions about race, authority, and accountability. Marcus watched his father handle the situation with a mixture of pride and concern. He'd never seen James this angry, but he'd also never seen him so completely in control of his anger. It was like watching a master class in righteous fury, channeled through professional competence and moral authority. Yet Marcus worried about the aftermath. Would his father face discipline for this public confrontation? "Security is en route," Sarah reported quietly to James. "ETA 5 minutes. Should I delay departure?" The question carried weight beyond scheduling concerns. It acknowledged that this incident had grown beyond routine passenger management into something that could affect the entire flight and potentially the captain's career. "We wait for security," James confirmed. "This aircraft doesn't move until this situation is properly resolved and documented." His decision meant inconveniencing hundreds of passengers, but he was clearly willing to accept that cost to protect his son's dignity and safety. The captain's authority was being tested not just by Richard Sterling, but by the choice between expedience and justice. Richard Sterling slumped in the stolen seat, finally understanding that his assumptions about power and privilege had led him into an unwinnable situation. The recording phones, hostile witnesses, and furious pilot had combined to create his personal nightmare. He was trapped at 30,000 feet before the plane had even left the ground, and the only way out was through consequences he'd spent his lifetime avoiding. Airport security's footsteps echoed through the jet bridge as 2 uniformed officers approached the aircraft. Their arrival transformed the cabin from a theater of conflict into a crime scene, with passengers craning their necks to see how the drama would unfold. Richard Sterling's face had gone pale, the reality of his situation finally penetrating the bubble of privilege that had protected him for 53 years. Officer Maria Santos entered first, her 20 years in airport security having taught her to read situations quickly. The body language told the story before anyone spoke. An angry father protecting his child, a cornered businessman realizing his mistakes, and dozens of witnesses eager to provide testimony. Behind her, Officer David Chen carried a tablet for documenting statements and evidence. "Captain Williams?" Officer Santos approached with professional respect. She'd worked with James before during weather delays and passenger emergencies, knew him as competent and level-headed. Seeing him this focused and angry immediately told her this was no routine passenger dispute. "We got a call about an assault and seat theft. Can you brief us on the situation?" James stepped forward, his captain's training taking over as he organized the facts for official consumption. "Officers, this is my son, Marcus Williams, age 17, traveling alone to Atlanta on Flight 447. Mr. Richard Sterling, seated in 14A, physically assaulted my son while stealing his assigned seat. The incident was witnessed by multiple passengers, some of whom recorded the interaction. Marcus felt strange being discussed in the third person while standing right there, but he understood his father was building an official record that could protect them both. The transformation from family moment to legal proceeding felt surreal, yet he recognized the necessity. This had moved beyond hurt feelings into criminal behavior that required proper documentation. "Mr. Sterling," Officer Santos addressed the businessman directly, "we need to hear your version of events." Her tone was professionally neutral, but her positioning, standing with clear sight lines to both the accused and potential witnesses, suggested she was taking the allegations seriously. Richard Sterling's expensive suit and executive bearing meant nothing in the face of documented assault. "This is all a misunderstanding," Richard began, his voice carrying less conviction than his words. "There was a seating confusion. Maybe I was a little forceful in trying to get to my seat, but assault? That's an exaggeration. These people are trying to make this about race when it's really just about airline seating procedures." His attempt to reframe the narrative fell flat in the face of multiple witnesses. Officer Chen was already taking statements from nearby passengers, his tablet filling with consistent accounts of Richard Sterling's behavior. The elderly woman from row 15 spoke with particular passion. "He elbowed that boy deliberately, called him names, acted like he owned the whole airplane. I've been flying for 60 years, and I never seen anything like it. A businessman in row 12 provided technical details that would matter in court. I saw the whole thing. The kid showed his boarding pass clearly, 14A, window seat. Sterling was already sitting there, refused to move, then physically pushed the boy when he persisted. Classic assault and theft of services, open and shut case. Sarah, the flight attendant, approached Officer Santos with additional information. Captain Williams is one of our most respected pilots. 30 years with the airline, perfect safety record, never had a passenger complaint. If he says there was an assault, I believe him completely. Plus, I witnessed the end of the confrontation myself. The weight of testimony was clearly shifting against Richard Sterling, whose businessman's instincts were screaming warnings about legal exposure and reputational damage. Social media was undoubtedly already spreading videos of the incident, and his corporate position would become untenable once his company's executives saw the footage. His privilege was evaporating in real time. "Officers," James said, "I want to press full charges for assault on a minor, theft of services, and any other applicable violations. My son was traveling alone, making him particularly vulnerable to this kind of intimidation. Mr. Sterling counted on that vulnerability and nearly succeeded in his theft." His father's voice mixed with his captain's authority to create something implacable and final. Marcus found his own voice, stepping forward despite his nervousness about speaking to police officers. "I tried to handle it politely. I showed him my boarding pass, asked him to check his own. He called me boy and said I should find another seat. When I didn't move fast enough, he elbowed me hard enough to knock me backward." His testimony was clear and direct, credible in its simplicity. Officer Santos looked at Richard Sterling with the expression of someone who'd seen too many people try to talk their way out of documented crimes. "Sir, based on multiple witness statements and the evidence we've gathered, you're under arrest for assault on a minor and theft of services. You have the right to remain silent." Her Miranda warning echoed through the cabin as she prepared handcuffs. "Wait!" Richard Sterling's composure finally cracked completely. "You can't arrest me! Do you know who I am? I'm the regional vice president of Sterling Industries. I have meetings in Atlanta worth millions of dollars. This will ruin me." His panic revealed the truth he'd been hiding. He understood exactly how serious his situation had become. The handcuffs clicked with metallic finality, and Richard Sterling's protests shifted to desperate bargaining. "Captain Williams, please. I have a family, a career. I made a mistake, but surely we can resolve this without destroying my life. I'll pay compensation, make donations, whatever you want. Just please don't let this go public." James looked at the man who'd assaulted his son, who'd tried to steal from a child, who'd used racial language to justify criminal behavior. 30 years of dealing with casual racism and professional discrimination had taught him that people like Richard Sterling only understood consequences, never learned from mercy. "Mr. Sterling, you made your choices. Now you live with them." Officer Chen documented the arrest while Officer Santos began the process of removing Richard Sterling from the aircraft. The businessman's corporate authority meant nothing against the reality of criminal behavior and documented evidence. His expensive suit looked rumpled and pathetic as he shuffled toward the exit in handcuffs, his career likely ending with each step. The cabin erupted in spontaneous applause as Richard Sterling was led away, passengers expressing their support for justice and their disgust with his behavior. Marcus felt overwhelmed by the community response, surprised by how many strangers had witnessed his humiliation and chosen to stand with him rather than look away. His faith in people received an unexpected boost. As the aircraft prepared for departure with Richard Sterling no longer aboard, James Williams retrieved his son's belongings and helped him settle into his rightfully assigned seat, 14A window. The incident was over, but both father and son understood that the aftermath would shape their relationship and their understanding of justice for years to come. With Richard Sterling removed in handcuffs, the airplane cabin buzzed with conversations as passengers processed what they'd witnessed. Flight attendants worked efficiently to reset the departure schedule while James Williams faced the reality of having very publicly arrested a passenger for assaulting his son. The captain's authority had been tested and upheld, but he knew challenges lay ahead. Marcus settled into seat 14A with mixed emotions coursing through his 17-year-old mind. Relief at having his father's protection warred with embarrassment at needing rescue, while pride in James's unwavering support mixed with worry about professional consequences. The window seat felt different now, not just a piece of airline real estate, but a symbol of dignity, defended, and justice served. "Ladies and gentlemen," James's voice came over the intercom system, reaching every passenger on the aircraft. "This is your captain speaking. We apologize for the departure delay, which was necessary to address a security situation that has now been resolved. We'll be wheels up in approximately 10 minutes, with an on-time arrival in Atlanta." His professional tone revealed nothing of the personal drama that had just unfolded. Sarah approached Marcus with a warm smile and a package of airline snacks. "From the flight crew," she said quietly. "We're all proud of how you handled yourself today." Your father raised a good man. Her gesture meant more than expensive gifts. It represented acceptance and support from people who work with James every day, and respected both his professional competence and personal character. As the aircraft finally pushed back from the gate, Marcus watched airport security vehicles through his window, presumably transporting Richard Sterling to whatever consequences awaited him. The businessman's expensive suit and executive credentials hadn't protected him from the reality of criminal behavior, a lesson that would hopefully resonate beyond this single incident. James completed his pre-flight checklist with the systematic precision that had made him one of the airline's most trusted captains, but part of his mind remained focused on his son 20 rows behind him. The intersection of his professional and personal lives had created a moment of truth that would define both relationships going forward. He'd chosen family over expedience, justice over convenience. During the smooth climb to cruising altitude, passengers began approaching Marcus to offer support and share their own stories of discrimination and injustice. An elderly veteran spoke about fighting racism in the military, while a young mother described teaching her children to stand up for themselves. The incident had created an unexpected community of solidarity 30,000 feet above Georgia. "Your father's a hero," said the businessman from row 12, stopping by Marcus's seat during the beverage service. "Too many people see injustice and look away." He saw his son being attacked and stepped up. That takes real courage, especially when you're risking your career to do it. His words echoed similar sentiments from passengers throughout the cabin. Marcus used his phone to record a video message for his grandmother, explaining that he might be a few minutes late due to an incident on the plane, but that everything was fine now. He chose his words carefully, not wanting to worry her, but needing to prepare her for the possibility that news coverage might reach Atlanta before he did. The flight crew treated Marcus with special attention throughout the journey, bringing extra snacks and checking on his comfort with genuine warmth. Their support felt like family acceptance. These people worked with his father every day and clearly respected him enough to extend that respect to his son. The airline might investigate the incident, but his father's colleagues stood firmly behind him. As they began descent into Atlanta, James's voice returned to the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're beginning our final approach to Atlanta. Weather is clear and beautiful, and we expect an on-time arrival. On behalf of the entire crew, thank you for flying with us today, and thank you for your patience during our departure delay." His professionalism never wavered, even in extraordinary circumstances. Marcus gathered his belongings and prepared for arrival, his backpack now containing business cards from passengers who wanted to serve as witnesses if legal proceedings continued. The photo of his father in uniform pressed against his chest felt heavier now, weighted with new meaning about courage, dignity, and the responsibility that came with standing up for what was right. The airplane touched down smoothly in Atlanta, James's skill evident in the barely perceptible contact with the runway. As passengers prepared to disembark, many stopped by Marcus's seat to offer final words of encouragement and support. Phone numbers were exchanged, social media connections made, and a network of solidarity established that extended far beyond a single flight. Marcus called the elderly woman from row 15 as she prepared to leave. "You remember this day, baby. You remember that when you stand up for yourself, good people will stand up with you. Your daddy showed you how to be a man today, and you showed him you already were one." Her words carried the weight of generational wisdom. As the cabin emptied, James emerged from the cockpit for the first time since the incident began, Father and son embraced in the empty airplane while flight attendants cleaned around them, the professional crisis finally giving way to personal connection. "I'm proud of you," James said quietly, "for standing up to him, for handling it with dignity, for being the man I raised you to be." The ground crew was already preparing the aircraft for its next departure as Marcus and James walked through the jet bridge together. Behind them lay an incident that would likely generate media attention, internal airline investigations, and legal proceedings. Ahead lay Marcus's grandmother, who would hear about her grandson's courage and her son-in-law's unwavering protection of family dignity. The Atlanta airport buzzed with normal activity as Marcus and James Williams walked through the terminal, but their minds remained focused on the extraordinary events that had just unfolded. Airport police intercepted them before they reached the baggage claim, requesting statements for the criminal case against Richard Sterling that was already building momentum through the legal system. Detective Lisa Rodriguez had been waiting for their arrival, her briefcase containing witness statements, video evidence, and a preliminary arrest report that painted a clear picture of assault and theft. 25 years in law enforcement had taught her to recognize open and shut cases, and this one met every criterion for successful prosecution. Richard Sterling's privilege wouldn't protect him in court. "Captain Williams, Marcus," Detective Rodriguez greeted them professionally. "I know you've had a difficult day, but I need to get your official statements while the details are fresh. Mr. Sterling has already been processed and is currently being held pending arraignment. His attorney is claiming this is all a misunderstanding, but the evidence strongly contradicts that narrative." They found a quiet office space where Marcus could recount his experience without the pressure of curious onlookers. His testimony was clear and consistent. He'd been polite, shown proper documentation, and been assaulted when he refused to accept theft of his assigned seat. The 17-year-old's composure impressed Detective Rodriguez, who'd seen many adult victims less articulate about their experiences. James provided his statement with the systematic precision of someone accustomed to emergency procedures and official documentation. Every detail was cataloged: the timeline of events, Sterling's exact words, the physical assault, the attempted racial intimidation. His pilot's training in accurate observation and reporting created a prosecutorial dream, credible witness with impeccable professional credentials. Marcus learned that Richard Sterling's employer had already been contacted by news media seeking comment on their executive's arrest. Sterling Industries was apparently conducting an internal investigation while distancing themselves from their regional vice president's behavior. His $50,000 annual travel budget wouldn't matter if he was facing criminal conviction and termination. The legal system moved with surprising speed when presented with clear evidence and multiple witnesses. Sterling's expensive defense attorney was already floating plea bargain possibilities, apparently recognizing that fighting the charges would only increase his client's exposure to both criminal penalties and civil liability. The businessman's assumptions about easy targets had created legal nightmares. "There's something else you should know," Detective Rodriguez said carefully. "This incident was recorded by multiple passengers and has already gone viral on social media. The airline's stock price actually went up today because of how Captain Williams handled the situation. Public opinion is strongly in your favor, but that also means media attention." James nodded grimly, understanding that viral social media meant scrutiny from airline executives, federal aviation authorities, and news organizations looking for compelling stories. His professional competence was unquestionable, but corporate bureaucracies sometimes punished people for being right in inconvenient ways. Protecting his son might cost him his career. Marcus felt overwhelmed by the implications of their experience becoming national news. His quiet trip to visit his grandmother had transformed into a symbol of resistance against everyday racism and corporate privilege. The teenager who'd just wanted his assigned airline seat was now inadvertently representing something much larger than himself. Detective Rodriguez handed them business cards and case numbers, explaining the legal process that would unfold over coming months. "Mr. Sterling will likely plead guilty to avoid trial, but you'll need to be available for victim impact statements and testimony if necessary. The evidence is overwhelming, so this should be straightforward from a prosecutorial standpoint." The civil lawsuit possibilities were also explained. Sterling's assault on a minor, particularly one traveling alone, created significant liability exposure. His corporate position and obvious wealth made him an attractive target for monetary damages, while his behavior was so clearly wrong that juries would likely be sympathetic to Marcus's experience. "Can I ask you something, Detective?" Marcus said as they prepared to leave. "Will this really make a difference? I mean, will people like Mr. Sterling actually change their behavior? Or will they just be more careful about getting caught?" His question reflected 17 years of experiencing casual racism and wondering whether individual incidents could create broader change. Detective Rodriguez considered the question seriously. "Marcus, I can't promise this will change everyone's behavior. But I can tell you that when people see consequences for racism and assault, it sends a message. Your courage in standing up to him and your father's courage in protecting you matters more than you might realize right now." As they finally headed toward baggage claim to collect Marcus's luggage, both father and son understood that their lives had changed permanently. The incident would follow them through legal proceedings, media coverage, and internal airline investigations. But they'd also discovered something powerful about standing up for dignity and justice, even when it required personal risk. The airport's normal chaos seemed muted after the intensity of their experience. Marcus spotted his grandmother waiting at the arrival gate, her face bright with anticipation for his visit. Soon, he'd have to explain why his simple flight had become a criminal case and viral social media story, but first he'd get to hug the woman who'd taught him that love was worth traveling for. By the time Marcus and James reached his grandmother's house in suburban Atlanta, the story had exploded across social media platforms with the viral intensity of a perfect storm. Pilot Dad was trending on Twitter, Instagram videos had garnered millions of views, and news organizations were scrambling to book interviews with the father-son duo who'd stood up to racist intimidation at 30,000 feet. Eleanor Williams, Marcus's 72-year-old grandmother, greeted them at her front door with a mixture of joy and concern. She'd been watching the news coverage unfold in real time, her pride in her family battling worry about the media attention that would inevitably follow. "Baby boy," she said, hugging Marcus tightly, "I saw what happened on the television. Are you all right?" The living room television displayed CNN's breaking news coverage. Pilot arrests passenger for assaulting his son. The Chiron scrolled additional details while talking heads debated airline authority, racial discrimination, and parental protection. Marcus felt surreal watching his own experience being dissected by strangers who'd reduced complex human emotions to sound bites and political talking points. James's phone buzzed constantly with calls from airline executives, news producers, and legal representatives trying to manage the crisis and opportunity that the incident had created. The airline's public relations department was actually spinning the story positively. Their captain had demonstrated leadership, protection of passengers, and unwavering professionalism under pressure. Stock prices reflected public approval. "Captain Williams showed exactly the kind of judgment and character we want in our pilots," the airline's CEO had told reporters. "He protected a passenger who happened to be his son from assault and theft. We're proud of his actions and fully support his decisions." The corporate backing meant James's career was likely safe, but also increased pressure for continued media cooperation. Eleanor made sweet tea and cornbread while 3 generations processed the day's events around her kitchen table. "Marcus, honey, tell me exactly what happened up there," she requested, needing to hear the story directly from her grandson rather than filtered through news reports that focused more on drama than human experience. As Marcus recounted the incident, Eleanor's expression shifted from concern to anger to fierce pride. She'd lived through the civil rights movement, had experienced segregation, and witnessed the slow progress toward equality. Seeing her grandson stand up for himself and her son-in-law stand up for him represented something profound about how far they'd come and how far they still had to go. "That Sterling man picked the wrong family to mess with," Eleanor declared with satisfaction. 3 generations of Williams men who don't back down from anybody. Your grandfather would be proud, James. He always said you raise children to stand up straight and look the world in the eye. Her words carried the weight of family history and hard-won wisdom. The doorbell rang throughout the evening as news crews requested interviews. Neighbors stopped by to offer support, and delivery drivers brought flowers and food from supporters across the country. Marcus felt overwhelmed by the attention, struggling to understand how his personal experience had become a national conversation about race, authority, and justice. James fielded calls from the Federal Aviation Administration, which was conducting a routine review of the incident to ensure proper procedures had been followed. His union representative assured him that his actions were completely justified and professionally appropriate, but also warned that federal bureaucracies sometimes created problems for people who attracted too much attention, even positive attention. By 10 o'clock that evening, Pilot Dad had generated over 2 million social media interactions, with overwhelming support for the Williams family's handling of the situation. Richard Sterling's name and corporate position had been widely reported, effectively ending his career regardless of legal outcomes. The businessman's assumptions about consequence-free racism had proven catastrophically wrong. Marcus used his grandmother's computer to read some of the online responses to the incident. Most were supportive and encouraging, but some revealed the persistent racism that had motivated Richard Sterling's behavior in the first place. Comment sections contained both inspiring solidarity and depressing evidence that the underlying problems remained unchanged. "Don't read those hateful comments, baby," Eleanor advised, seeing her grandson's expression darken. "Focus on the good people who stood up for you today. The passengers on that plane, your daddy, all these folks sending messages of support. That's what matters. The people who choose love over hate when it counts." James made the decision to accept one television interview, choosing a respected news program that would allow them to tell their story thoughtfully rather than sensationally. "We do this once, together, and then we try to get back to normal life," he told his family. "People need to hear what really happened, but we're not going to become professional victims or celebrities." The media requests continued flooding in. Talk shows, documentary producers, book publishers, and motivational speaking agencies, all sensing opportunity in the Williams family's experience. But Eleanor's kitchen table felt like the safest place in the world, surrounded by love and sweet tea, and the certainty that they'd done the right thing regardless of consequences. As Marcus prepared for bed in his grandmother's spare room, he reflected on how much his life had changed in a single day. He'd boarded a plane as a teenager visiting family and disembarked as an inadvertent symbol of resistance against everyday racism. The weight of representation felt heavy on his 17-year-old shoulders. His phone contained hundreds of friend requests, message notifications, and social media tags that would take weeks to process. But the most important message was a simple text from his mother back home. "Proud of my men. See you soon. Love you both." Some things remained unchanged despite viral fame and national attention. Richard Sterling sat in his expensive attorney's office, staring at newspaper headlines that chronicled the complete destruction of his carefully constructed life. "Executive arrested for racist assault on teen" dominated the business section, while social media screenshots showed his face alongside words like privilege, entitlement, and consequences. His 53 years of assumed superiority had collapsed in less than 24 hours. Michael Davidson, Sterling's defense attorney, spread legal documents across his mahogany desk with the grim efficiency of someone delivering terminal diagnoses. "Richard, we need to discuss your options, and honestly, none of them are good. The evidence is overwhelming, the witnesses are credible, and the video footage makes denial impossible. Your best chance is accepting responsibility and hoping for leniency." Sterling Industries had moved with corporate efficiency to distance themselves from their former regional vice president. A terse press release announced his immediate termination for conduct inconsistent with company values, while Human Resources began the process of clawing back stock options and bonus payments. His corner office was being cleared by security guards who'd once treated him with obsequious respect. The businessman's phone contained dozens of missed calls from reporters, former colleagues, and country club associates, none of whom were offering support or assistance. His social circle had evaporated as quickly as his corporate position, leaving him isolated with the consequences of behavior that had seemed acceptable when he thought he could avoid accountability. "What about the hate crime charges?" Sterling asked desperately. "I never used racial slurs. I was just trying to get to my seat." His attempt to minimize the incident ignored the multiple witnesses who'd heard his language and the clear pattern of racial targeting that prosecutors were building. Davidson's expression suggested that denial remained his client's preferred strategy. Richard, you called a black teenager boy, questioned his right to his assigned seat, physically assaulted him when he didn't comply, and then questioned his father's qualifications as a pilot based on race, Davidson recited patiently. Federal prosecutors are salivating over this case because it's everything they need for hate crime enhancement charges. The civil lawsuit paperwork had already been filed by the Williams family's attorney, seeking damages for assault, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and civil rights violations. Sterling's assets, the suburban mansion, investment portfolio, and luxury vehicles, were potentially at risk depending on how aggressively the family chose to pursue monetary compensation. Sterling's wife had moved out of their home, taking their teenage children to stay with her sister while she consulted divorce attorneys about protecting family assets from her husband's legal exposure. 25 years of marriage hadn't survived 24 hours of viral racism. As she realized the man she'd married had been capable of behavior she found morally reprehensible. The media attention makes everything worse, Davidson explained. Normally, a first-time offender might get probation and community service for simple assault, but when your case becomes a national symbol of racial privilege and corporate entitlement, judges feel pressure to send messages. You're looking at potential jail time. Sterling's country club membership had been suspended pending review. His corporate board positions were being quietly eliminated, and his professional reputation was permanently destroyed. The businessman who'd built his identity around success and status discovered that both could disappear faster than his assumptions about consequence-free behavior. The psychological evaluation ordered by the court wouldn't be completed for several weeks, but Sterling's behavior during the airplane incident suggested someone who'd never faced real consequences for racist assumptions. His shock at being held accountable revealed a man who'd lived his entire adult life in a bubble of privilege that protected him from normal social and legal constraints. "What if I apologize?" Sterling suggested desperately. "A public apology, maybe community service, donations to civil rights organizations. There has to be something I can do to make this go away." His businessman's instincts still sought deals and negotiations, unable to accept that some consequences couldn't be managed or minimized. Davidson shook his head grimly. "Richard, you assaulted a minor in front of dozens of witnesses on an airplane while making racially motivated statements. This isn't a business deal or a public relations problem. It's criminal behavior with federal implications. Apologies don't erase felony charges." The preliminary hearing was scheduled for the following week, where Sterling would face formal charges and enter his plea. Davidson recommended accepting a plea bargain if prosecutors offered one, understanding that a jury trial would likely result in maximum penalties given the overwhelming evidence and public sentiment against his client. Sterling's reflection on the airplane incident remained self-serving and delusional. In his mind, he'd simply tried to secure a better seat and been victimized by an oversensitive teenager and his power-abusing father. The concept that his behavior had been criminal, racist, and morally wrong hadn't penetrated his protective layer of entitlement and self-justification. "The irony," Davidson observed, "is that if you'd just moved to your assigned seat when the boy asked politely, none of this would have happened. You could have kept your job, your family, your reputation. Instead, you chose to escalate at every opportunity until you created your own nightmare." As Sterling left his attorney's office, reporters waited outside with cameras and microphones, hoping for statements or reactions that could fuel additional news cycles. He pulled his jacket over his head and hurried to his car, experiencing for the first time the sensation of being hunted rather than hunting. His assumptions about power and protection had proven catastrophically wrong. The drive home to his empty mansion provided time to contemplate the complete reversal of his circumstances. 24 hours earlier, he'd been a successful executive with authority, respect, and assumed immunity from consequences. Now he faced criminal charges, financial ruin, and social exile, all because he'd believed a black teenager was an acceptable target for racist intimidation. 6 months after the airplane incident, Marcus Williams sat in his high school's auditorium, preparing to deliver a speech about courage and dignity to an audience of students, parents, and community leaders. The 17-year-old who'd simply wanted his assigned airline seat had become an inadvertent spokesperson for standing up to everyday racism, a role he'd initially resisted but eventually embraced. The criminal case against Richard Sterling had concluded with a plea bargain, 18 months in federal prison, 3 years probation, and mandatory community service with civil rights organizations. The businessman's fall from executive privilege to convicted felon had been swift and complete, a cautionary tale about the consequences of unchecked racism and entitlement. James Williams stood at the back of the auditorium, his pilot's uniform freshly pressed for the ceremony honoring his son's courage. The airline had eventually promoted him to chief pilot, recognizing that his handling of the incident had demonstrated exactly the kind of leadership and moral courage they wanted in senior positions. His career had not only survived but flourished. The hardest part, Marcus told the audience, wasn't being pushed or called names. It was the moment when I had to decide whether to fight for my dignity or just find another seat. My dad taught me that some things are worth standing up for, even when it's scary or uncomfortable. Eleanor Williams occupied a front-row seat, her pride in her grandson evident to everyone in the auditorium. At 72, she'd lived through the civil rights movement and witnessed decades of progress, setbacks, and continuing struggles. Seeing Marcus find his voice as an advocate gave her hope that each generation could build on the sacrifices of those who came before. The civil lawsuit had been settled out of court for an undisclosed amount that would fund Marcus's college education and support civil rights organizations. Richard Sterling's assets had been substantially depleted by legal fees and damages, but the financial consequences paled compared to the personal and professional destruction he'd experienced. I learned that ordinary people can do extraordinary things when they choose courage over comfort, Marcus continued, his voice steady, despite the magnitude of the audience. Every person on that airplane had a choice about whether to speak up or look away. Most of them chose to stand with me, and that made all the difference. The story had inspired legislative action at both state and federal levels, with new protections for airline passengers and enhanced penalties for hate crimes in transportation settings. Marcus had testified before congressional committees, his articulate testimony helping to humanize policy debates that often became abstract discussions of statistics rather than personal experiences. James watched his son speak with the same systematic attention he applied to flight planning and emergency procedures. The boy who'd needed his father's protection 6 months earlier had grown into a young man capable of protecting others through advocacy and education. The transformation filled James with pride and hope for the future. Richard Sterling had completed his psychological evaluation and begun serving his prison sentence, a development that Marcus followed with mixed emotions. He felt no joy in the man's downfall, but recognized that consequences had been necessary to validate his own dignity and deter similar behavior by others who might assume they could target vulnerable people without accountability. The most important lesson, Marcus told the audience, is that justice isn't just about punishing bad behavior. It's about creating a world where people feel safe standing up for themselves and others. When we see injustice and choose to act, we make things better for everyone. The speech concluded with sustained applause and a standing ovation that lasted several minutes. Students surrounded Marcus afterward, sharing their own experiences with discrimination and asking for advice about finding courage in difficult situations. The teenager who'd been victimized had become a source of strength for others facing similar challenges. As the Williams family drove home through Atlanta traffic, they reflected on how profoundly their lives had changed since that day on Flight 447. The incident had brought them closer together while also connecting them to a broader community of people committed to justice and equality. Their personal experience had become part of something larger than themselves. "I'm proud of the man you're becoming," James told his son as they pulled into Eleanor's driveway. Standing up to Sterling took courage, but using that experience to help other people takes wisdom. "You're making a difference, Marcus." The father's approval meant everything to the young man who'd learned about dignity by watching it defended. Eleanor prepared dinner while 3 generations of Williams men discussed college plans, career aspirations, and the ongoing responsibility that came with their unexpected platform for advocacy. Marcus would attend college on academic scholarships and settlement funds, but he'd also carry forward the lessons learned about courage, justice, and the importance of standing up for what's right. The airplane incident had lasted less than an hour, but its consequences would ripple through their lives for decades to come. Marcus had learned that dignity was worth defending. James had discovered that moral courage could enhance rather than threaten professional success, and Eleanor had seen her family's values validated in the most public way possible. 6 months later, Flight 447 continued its daily service between major cities, but the crew and regular passengers remembered the day when a father's love and a son's courage had created a moment of perfect justice 30,000 feet above the ground. The memory served as a reminder that ordinary people could create extraordinary change when they chose to stand up for what was right. As Marcus prepared for bed in his grandmother's house, he thought about Richard Sterling serving his prison sentence and wondered whether the experience would teach him anything about the humanity he'd tried to deny. Redemption was possible for everyone, but it required acknowledgement of harm caused and genuine commitment to change, something that remained to be seen. The viral hashtag #PilotDad had faded from social media trending lists, but its impact continued through policy changes, inspired activism, and countless individual moments when people chose courage over comfort. Marcus's simple insistence on his assigned airline seat had become a symbol of resistance against everyday racism, proving that dignity defended was dignity preserved for everyone. 2 years after the airplane incident, Marcus Williams walked across the stage at his high school graduation, his cap and gown billowing in the warm Atlanta breeze. The young man who'd once been pushed in an airplane aisle had grown into a confident advocate, his college acceptance letters including full scholarships to prestigious universities that had recruited him not just for academics, but for his demonstrated leadership in civil rights activism. Eleanor Williams cheered from the audience as her grandson accepted his diploma, her voice joining hundreds of others celebrating the class of 2025. Beside her, James beamed with pride. His captain's uniform replaced today with a simple suit that couldn't contain his joy at seeing Marcus achieve this milestone. The family had weathered media storms and legal proceedings, emerging stronger and more united than ever. The graduation speaker was Congresswoman Sarah Martinez, who'd invited Marcus to testify during hearings on transportation discrimination. Today's graduates face a world where individual courage can spark systemic change, she told the assembled crowd. Young people like Marcus Williams prove that standing up for justice isn't just about personal dignity, it's about creating a better future for everyone. After the ceremony, Marcus found himself surrounded by classmates and teachers who'd watched his transformation from quiet teenager to national advocate. His English teacher, Mrs. Johnson, presented him with a scrapbook documenting his journey from viral video victim to congressional witness to scholarship recipient. "You've shown us all what it means to turn adversity into opportunity," she said warmly. The celebration moved to Eleanor's backyard, where friends and family gathered for a graduation party that felt more like a community event. Neighbors who'd supported the family during the media frenzy brought food and congratulations, while Marcus's advocacy organization friends traveled from across the country to honor his achievement. The airplane incident had created an extended family of justice advocates. James pulled his son aside during the festivities, his expression serious despite the celebratory atmosphere. "Marcus, I need to tell you something that I've kept private until now. 3 airlines have approached me about joining their diversity and inclusion programs, specifically because of how we handled that situation with Sterling. They want me to help train pilots and crew members on recognizing and responding to discrimination." The revelation that his father's career had been enhanced rather than damaged by their stand for justice filled Marcus with additional pride. Too often, doing the right thing came with professional costs, but James had demonstrated that moral courage could actually strengthen leadership credentials when supported by competent performance and community respect. "There's something else," James continued, his voice dropping to ensure privacy. "Richard Sterling's attorney contacted our lawyer last week. He's being released from prison next month and wants to arrange a meeting with us. He's claiming he wants to apologize and make amends, but we don't have to agree to anything you're not comfortable with." Marcus considered the request carefully, weighing his desire to move forward against the potential value of face-to-face accountability. Sterling's imprisonment had been necessary for justice, But Marcus had always wondered whether the man truly understood the harm he'd caused or simply regretted getting caught. A meeting might provide answers to questions that had lingered for 2 years. "I think I'd like to hear what he has to say," Marcus decided. "Not because I owe him anything, but because I want to know if prison taught him something about the humanity he tried to deny. Maybe his story could help other people understand the real costs of racism." His mature reasoning impressed James, who saw his son weighing justice against mercy with wisdom beyond his years. The party continued into the evening, with speakers sharing stories about Marcus's impact on their own courage and advocacy. A young black girl from his school talked about standing up to bullies after seeing his example, while an elderly civil rights veteran praised his generation's ability to use technology and media to expose injustice. The ripple effects continued expanding. As guests departed, Marcus found himself alone with his grandmother on her front porch, the same space where they'd processed the airplane incident's immediate aftermath. Eleanor rocked slowly in her chair, her eyes bright with memories of struggles overcome and progress achieved. "Baby, do you ever regret getting on that airplane?" she asked softly. "No, Grandma," Marcus replied without hesitation. "I regret that it happened, but I don't regret how we handled it. Dad taught me that dignity defended is dignity preserved, and you taught me that love is stronger than hate. Everything that followed proved those lessons were right." His words carried the certainty of someone who'd tested principles under fire and found them sound. Eleanor smiled, remembering her own grandmother's stories about surviving segregation and fighting for basic human dignity. Each generation faced its own tests of character, and Marcus had passed his with flying colors. "Your great-great-grandmother would be proud," she said. "She always said that courage wasn't about not being scared. It was about doing right despite being scared." The evening air carried sounds of Atlanta's urban rhythm, but the porch felt like a sanctuary where 3 generations of Williams family wisdom converged. Marcus would leave for college in the fall, carrying forward lessons learned through adversity and advocacy. The airplane incident had ended, but its legacy would influence decisions and relationships for decades to come. James joined them on the porch, his presence completing the family circle that had been tested and strengthened by their shared experience. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities, but tonight they could rest in the certainty that they'd faced their trial with dignity, courage, and love. The ripple effects of their stand for justice would continue spreading long after they were gone. The federal courthouse in Atlanta buzzed with quiet activity as Marcus Williams, now 21 and a junior at Howard University, waited in a conference room for a meeting he'd both anticipated and dreaded. 3.5 years had passed since Richard Sterling assaulted him on Flight 447, and the former businessman had requested this face-to-face encounter as part of his rehabilitation and community service requirements. James Williams sat beside his son, his airline captain's uniform replaced by civilian clothes that couldn't diminish his natural authority. The years had been kind to the Williams family. James now served as the airline industry's leading expert on discrimination prevention, while Marcus had become a sought-after speaker on civil rights and social justice issues among college students nationwide. Eleanor Williams, now 75 but still sharp, occupied the 3rd chair at the conference table. She'd insisted on attending despite Marcus's concerns about her health, arguing that she'd earned the right to look Richard Sterling in the eye and assess whether his claimed transformation was genuine. Her presence represented generational wisdom about justice, forgiveness, and accountability. The door opened to admit Richard Sterling, accompanied by his parole officer and a social worker from the community service program, where he'd been volunteering for 6 months. The man who entered bore little resemblance to the arrogant executive who had pushed a teenager in an airplane aisle. Prison had aged him dramatically, his expensive suits replaced by simple clothing that reflected his reduced circumstances. Sterling's eyes immediately found Marcus, and the recognition was clearly painful. The confident businessman who'd once dismissed a black teenager as unworthy of basic respect now faced that same young man as an accomplished college student and national advocate. The power dynamic had shifted completely, leaving Sterling to request rather than demand attention. "Mr. Williams, Mrs. Williams, Marcus," Sterling began, his voice carrying none of its former authority. "Thank you for agreeing to see me." I know I have no right to ask for your time or attention after what I did." His opening acknowledged the debt he owed, a significant change from his earlier attempts to minimize his behavior and avoid accountability. Marcus studied the man who'd changed his life trajectory, looking for signs of genuine remorse versus calculated performance. Sterling's body language suggested real shame: hunched shoulders, downcast eyes, trembling hands that spoke of someone confronting uncomfortable truths about himself. Prison had apparently forced self-reflection that wealth and privilege had previously prevented. "I've spent 3 years thinking about that day," Sterling continued, "and I've come to understand things about myself that I'd managed to avoid for 53 years. My behavior toward you was criminal, racist, and inexcusable. I targeted you because I thought you were vulnerable and wouldn't fight back. I was wrong about your vulnerability, and I was wrong about everything else." James listened carefully to Sterling's words, his pilot's training and risk assessment helping him evaluate sincerity versus manipulation. The man seemed genuinely broken by his experience, but James had seen enough people try to perform their way out of consequences to remain cautious about accepting redemption claims at face value. Eleanor spoke for the first time, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd survived decades of racism and witnessed countless apologies from people caught behaving badly. "Mr. Sterling, what do you want from us?" "My grandson doesn't owe you forgiveness, and we don't owe you absolution. What are you hoping to accomplish here?" Sterling's response revealed the depth of his fall from executive privilege to social pariah. "Mrs. Williams, I'm not asking for forgiveness because I don't deserve it. I'm asking for the chance to show that people can change, that the consequences I faced taught me something real about the harm I caused. I want to spend the rest of my life making amends." Marcus found his voice, the confidence built through years of advocacy evident in his tone. "Mr. Sterling, what have you learned about why you thought it was acceptable to treat me that way? Because understanding your motivation might help other people recognize similar thinking in themselves before it leads to criminal behavior." The question forced Sterling to articulate insights that had apparently cost him considerable psychological pain to achieve. "I realized that I'd spent my entire life in bubbles of privilege that protected me from consequences and feedback. I'd never had to see black people as fully human because I could always retreat to spaces where my assumptions weren't challenged. You became real to me only when your father stepped out of that cockpit." The admission was ugly but honest, revealing the systematic dehumanization that enabled casual racism. Sterling's willingness to acknowledge this uncomfortable truth suggested genuine self-examination rather than superficial apologizing. James recognized the courage required to face such devastating insights about oneself, even as he maintained skepticism about Sterling's ultimate motivations. "What are you doing now?" Marcus asked. "How are you trying to make amends?" His questions reflected genuine curiosity about whether Sterling's transformation had produced meaningful action or remained limited to philosophical revelations that cost nothing to express. Sterling described his work with the Community Service Organization, where he'd been teaching financial literacy to formerly incarcerated individuals and victims of economic discrimination. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The man who'd lost everything due to racist behavior was now helping people recover from systemic disadvantages he'd previously ignored or perpetuated. "I also speak to corporate groups about unconscious bias and the real costs of discriminatory behavior," Sterling added. "My story serves as a cautionary tale about how quickly privilege can disappear when it's used to harm others. Most executives think they're immune from consequences until they see what happened to me." Eleanor studied Sterling's face during his explanations, her lifetime of reading people helping her assess his sincerity. Something in his manner suggested authentic remorse rather than performed repentance, though she remained cautious about extending trust to someone who'd proven capable of such calculated cruelty. "Mr. Sterling," Marcus said finally, "I appreciate that you wanted to apologize in person, and I believe you've learned something from your experience. But I need you to understand that your redemption isn't about our forgiveness. It's about your commitment to being better. Don't waste the rest of your life seeking absolution from your victims. Spend it preventing other people from becoming victims." The meeting concluded with handshakes rather than embraces, acknowledgement rather than reconciliation. Sterling left understanding that his path forward required action rather than approval, while the Williams family departed with confirmation that justice had indeed taught necessary lessons. The circle had closed, but the spiral of growth and healing would continue. As they walked through the courthouse lobby, Marcus reflected on how much his life had changed since that day on the airplane. The scared teenager who'd just wanted his assigned seat had become a confident advocate capable of extending grace to his former tormentor. The incident that had threatened to diminish him had ultimately expanded his capacity for both justice and mercy. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It was created to expose the harsh realities of racial prejudice, abuse of power, and the dehumanization faced by marginalized communities. This narrative aims to raise awareness, provoke outrage, and inspire action toward justice, accountability, and dignity for all.